The man was already half frozen when he heard the sound. It was the kind of sound that should not have existed in a January night in Spokane. That small high whimper rising and falling under the hum of the bus depot heaters 2 blocks over, and Reed Calloway stopped walking with his torn boots crunching the salted ice and listened, with the side of his head tilted the way Marine combat engineers learn to tilt their heads when they are listening for the soft tick of a buried wire under the desert sand. The sound came again. Smaller, weaker, a breath at the end of it like a child trying not to die. He turned off the alley between the Davenport laundromat and the boarded-up shoe repair, pushed through a gap in the chain link, and there, in the slush behind the dumpster, half buried in a snowbank that the city plow had thrown up against the brick, he saw the puppy. She was no bigger than a loaf of bread, black and tan, the saddle marking already coming in across her tiny back, ears too big for her skull and not yet upright, eyes wet and brown and too old for an animal that small. She was shivering so hard the snow around her was vibrating. She had been left there. He could see the shape in the snow where someone had simply dropped her and walked away. Reed Calloway, who had told himself 2 hours ago that he would walk into the river before sunrise, knelt down in the slush and unzipped his torn olive-drab field jacket and reached into the snowbank and lifted the puppy out, and her body was so cold against his bare cold torso under the open jacket that he almost dropped her. And he said only one word out loud in that alley to no one and to God and to the cold. Lord. He zipped the puppy inside his jacket against his ribs where his heart was, and the puppy stopped whimpering. And Reed sat down with his back against the brick and pulled his knees up and curled around the small warm shape inside his coat, and felt something in his chest break open that he had thought was sealed shut for good. He did not walk into the river that night. He fell asleep in the snowbank with the puppy curled against his sternum, and a thin, steady ribbon of his breath rising into the salt-streaked Spokane sky, and his dog tags pressed cold against the puppy's spine, and the city plowing the next street over without ever knowing that a man and a 6-week-old life had decided together in that alley not to die. They woke at first light. The puppy was alive, so was he. He named her in the gray dawn while she was nursing on the corner of a stale corn muffin he had been saving in his jacket pocket for 3 days. He named her Juno because his mother had once read him a Roman story about a queen of the gods who looked after starving children. And because his mother had been dead for 11 years and he wanted to say her name out loud in a way that would not break him. And because Juno was a soft enough name to carry in his mouth when there was nothing else to carry. He looked down at the puppy with corn muffin crumbs on her wet black nose and said very quietly, just so she would hear it, "Hello, Juno. I am Reed. I am going to take care of you, even if I do not know how." The next morning, he walked her in the inside pocket of his coat to the Sacred Heart Soup Kitchen on Sprague Avenue and sat at the long folding table near the radiator and ate his bowl of split-pea soup with one hand and fed the puppy slow, soft pieces of biscuit with the other, and Hattie Merriweather, the wiry, sun-creased volunteer in the sage-green apron, sat down across from him with her round, wire-rimmed glasses fogged and her arthritic hands wrapped around her own coffee mug, and looked at the puppy with a long, quiet look. "Where did you find that, Reed Calloway?" he told her. She nodded slowly. "You are going to need milk replacer and a heating pad, and a vet that does not ask questions." Reed said he could not pay for any of those things. Hattie said she did not recall asking. The next afternoon, there was a plastic grocery bag waiting for him under the radiator with a tin of Esbilac powder, a small rubber syringe, 2 clean dish towels, and a phone number written on the back of a church bulletin in Hattie's careful old lady handwriting. "Dr. Sage Quintero. Tell her Hattie sent you." The vet was a soft-spoken, brown-eyed woman in her mid-30s who saw them in the back lot of her clinic after hours, in the bed of her old Subaru with the tailgate down and a heat lamp clipped to the canopy frame, and she examined Juno without ever asking Reed for a wallet, and she said the puppy was small and the puppy was hungry, and the puppy had a very minor infection in her left ear, and the puppy was, in her professional opinion, going to live. Reed cried for the first time in 7 years in the back of that Subaru, with the heat lamp orange on his face and the puppy asleep on a folded towel and Dr. Quintero pretending to look at a chart so she would not see him cry. So they began their winter. He slept in the basement of St. Aloysius Church on the cold nights when Hattie left the side door unlatched for him, with Juno curled inside his jacket against his ribs and his duffel bag for a pillow. He slept under the railroad bridge on the milder nights with Juno tucked between his thermal Henley and his bare cold chest, and his arms wrapped around her as a windbreak. He sold his last possession that was not a piece of clothing, a tarnished Marine Corps challenge coin from his unit in Anbar, to a pawn shop on Trent Avenue for $42, and used every dollar of it on puppy food and a small thrift store Sherpa-lined dog blanket, and walked back into the cold without the coin in his pocket for the first time since he had been 17 years old. The coin had been the last physical object that connected him to Captain Henrik Volkov, his old commanding officer, and he had carried it in his right front pocket every single day for 11 years, and it was worn smooth on both sides from his thumb, and he sold it for puppy food without flinching, and Juno gained half a pound that week, and he decided that Captain Volkov would have understood. He talked to her the way he had once talked to his men on patrol. "Easy now, Juno, easy. Watch the curb, watch the ice. Heel up!" Stay with me, girl." She learned to walk at his left heel by the time she was 9 weeks old. She learned to sit when he put his hand flat by his hip. She learned to lie down when he tapped his sternum twice. She learned to look up at his face when he said her name in his low marine voice, the way he used to look up at the captain when the captain said his name in his low marine voice. And Reed felt for the first time in a long time that he was teaching something instead of forgetting something. He stopped drinking. He had not been a heavy drinker, only a steady one, only the cheap fortified wine they sold in the back of the store coolers near the bus station. Only the kind that lets a man sleep without dreams about an Anbar service road and a captain dying in his arms with sand in his teeth. He poured the last bottle into the gutter behind St. Aloysius, the morning Juno first wagged her stubby tail at him because she was watching, and he did not want her watching that. He still had the dreams. Some nights he woke in the church basement gasping with the captain's blood on his hands, with the IED smell of burned wiring in his nose, with the captain's last word in his ears, the word that the captain had said to him while Reed was holding the captain's chest closed with both hands, the word that Reed had not been able to say out loud since. Reed. Some nights he woke, and Juno was on his chest, 10 weeks old now and 12 pounds, with her cold, wet puppy nose against the pulse in his throat, watching him in the dark with her 2 old brown eyes and waiting for him to come back from wherever he had gone. He would put his rough, chapped hand on her small, warm back and breathe with her until his breath matched her breath. He would whisper, "I am here, Juno. I am here." And he would mean both of them when he said it. 3 months passed in this way. 3 months of walking the ice between St. Aloysius and the soup kitchen and the railroad bridge and Dr. Quintero's backlot. 3 months of Hattie pretending not to slip extra biscuits into his bowl. 3 months of Juno growing inch by inch, of her ears starting to stand, of her saddle marking deepening, of her small body filling out under his ribs at night. 3 months of Reed Calloway, Marine Combat Engineer, formerly of the 2nd Battalion 4th Marines, age 38, last permanent address a sandbag wall outside Ramadi, becoming, by accident, a man with a reason to wake up in the morning. He did not know it yet, but on the cold gray morning of the 90th day, while he was sitting at his usual folding table near the radiator at Sacred Heart with Juno asleep at his left boot, a woman in a tailored navy blue wool overcoat was driving a silver rental sedan north on Highway 395 from the Spokane airport, with a manila folder on the passenger seat beside her and the words, "Calloway, Reed M." USMC printed across the tab of the folder in clean black serif type, and a small silver cross at her throat catching the cold winter sun. Imogen Trask had been driving for 40 minutes, and she still had not finished the coffee in the cardboard cup in the console, because the coffee at the Spokane Airport Hertz counter had tasted of burned plastic, and her late husband had once told her that you should never drink coffee out of obligation, and she missed her late husband sharply at the second exit for Country Homes Boulevard, and she let herself miss him for exactly the length of one stoplight before she turned her wrist on the steering wheel and adjusted the heater and brought her mind back to the manila folder on the seat beside her. Calloway. Reed M. The folder had been on her desk in Helena for 9 days. It had moved, with her, from the leather inbox to the active stack, to the corner of the credenza, to the passenger seat of a silver Toyota rental. And it was, in her professional opinion as a 13-year estate attorney, the strangest will instruction she had ever been asked to execute. The deceased had not been her client. The deceased had been her client's mother-in-law. Eleanor Volkov, 81 years old, of Boulder Spring Ranch, Township of Helena, Lewis and Clark County, State of Montana, had died on a Tuesday morning in late October with her old hand around her old husband's old wedding photograph, and her last instruction had been to find a man named Reed Calloway. The instruction had been carried out by Eleanor's son, who had hired Imogen, who had hired a private investigator from Coeur d'Alene, who had spent 6 weeks working through the Veterans Affairs System and the Department of Defense, and 3 Spokane homeless outreach networks before coming back with 1 printed photograph and 1 address. The photograph was of a thin, weathered Marine in a Spokane soup kitchen line with a German Shepherd puppy half tucked inside his torn olive-drab field jacket. The address was Sacred Heart Mission, 1102 East Sprague Avenue, between the hours of 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. Imogen had read the will twice, the night the photograph came in. She had cried once, briefly, in her office at midnight with the door closed. She had not told her son why. She found the soup kitchen at 11:14 in the morning. She parked the rental 2 blocks down because there was no closer parking, and she walked the iced sidewalk in her oxblood Oxfords with her satchel against her hip and her navy overcoat buttoned high and her breath in slow plumes, and she paused at the doorway of Sacred Heart and adjusted the small silver cross at her throat the way she always did when she was about to do something difficult. And she stepped inside. The smell of soup, the clatter of mismatched ceramic, the brown linoleum and the long folding tables, and the old radiator hissing under the fogged windows, and the small, soft sound of a German Shepherd puppy under one of the tables, asleep on a man's left boot. Imogen Trask, who had argued land easements at the Montana Supreme Court and read 3,000 wills in her career, walked across that brown linoleum and stopped at the end of the table, where a man in a torn olive-drab field jacket and a charcoal-gray watch cap was eating split-pea soup with one hand. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly. "Reed M. Calloway, late of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines." He looked up at her. His blue-gray eyes were deep-set and crow's-footed and tired. The puppy on his boot, who had grown to 14 pounds and whose ears were standing crooked, lifted her head and looked at Imogen with the same wary intelligence. Reed put his spoon down very slowly. "Mom," he said. He had not been called Mr. Calloway in 11 years. "May I sit?" Imogen said. He nodded once. She sat across from him. She took the manila folder out of her satchel. She placed it on the table between them and turned it so it faced him. "My name is Imogen Trask," she said. "I am an estate attorney from Helena, Montana. I've been retained by the family of the late Eleanor Volkov." Reed went very still, the way a man goes still when a wire ticks under the desert sand. "Eleanor," he said, "the captain's wife." "Yes," Imogen said. "Mrs. Volkov passed away on October 28th, in her sleep, at home." Peacefully, Reed lowered his head. He put his rough, chapped hand flat on the table beside the folder. He breathed out very slowly. The puppy under his boot let out a small, worried whine. Reed reached his other hand down without looking and laid it on the puppy's small back, and the puppy quieted. "I am sorry to tell you this here," Imogen said. "I would have preferred a different room. But I have looked for you for 6 weeks, and Mrs. Volkov's instructions were specific, and time matters." Reed looked up at her. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "What did Eleanor want with me, ma'am?" Imogen opened the folder. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Eleanor and Henrik Volkov owned a property called Boulder Spring Ranch in the foothills of the Big Belt Mountains, 22 miles east of Helena, Montana. 240 acres, a farmhouse, a barn, a creek, a pond, a line of cottonwood. They bought it in 1971 with money from Henrik's grandfather. They had no children of their own. After Henrik died in Iraq in 2012, Eleanor lived there alone with her brother, visiting in the summers, and a hired hand on weekends until she passed last October. Reed's jaw was working. The captain had spoken about the ranch to his men around the burn barrel one cold night in Anbar in 2012. 4 nights before he died, he had spoken about the cottonwoods and the creek and the spring water, and how Eleanor made coffee on a wood stove in the winter. Reed had listened with his rifle across his knees and the desert cold in his fingers. Imogen turned a page. By a will executed in 2015 and reaffirmed in 2023, Mrs. Volkov bequeathed the entirety of Boulder Spring Ranch, in fee simple, free and clear of all encumbrances, with the residence, outbuildings, livestock, mineral rights, water rights, and a separate endowment of $280,000 for property maintenance and continued operation, to one Reed M. Calloway, formerly Sergeant, USMC, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, on the express stated condition, and I quote, that he take it as a debt long owed, and not as a gift. Reed sat with his rough, chapped hand flat on the table, and his other hand on the puppy's back, and his blue-gray eyes on the manila folder, and he did not move for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very low. "This has to be a mistake, ma'am." Imogen shook her head once. "No mistake, Mr. Calloway. Mrs. Volkov was specific. She named you in 3 separate conversations with her son, in 2 prior drafts, and in a sealed letter that I have here in this folder addressed to you in her handwriting." Reed swallowed. "I do not deserve this." The puppy under his boot whined again, longer this time, and stood up and laid her small chin on his torn jeans. Imogen looked at the puppy. Then she looked at Reed. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "with respect, that is not a determination you are asked to make today. The terms of the will do not require you to deserve anything. The terms require you to come to Helena, sign 3 pages, and accept the keys to a house your captain's widow wanted you to have. After that, what you do with it is between you and God." Reed laughed once, a low, broken sound that was not really a laugh. He looked down at the puppy. Then he looked back at Imogen. "May I bring her?" he said. Imogen looked at the small 14-pound German shepherd at his boot, with her crooked ears and her wet brown eyes. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "the will specifies a working ranch. I would imagine that ranch has been waiting for that puppy as much as it has been waiting for you." Reed nodded slowly. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He folded his rough, chapped hands together in front of the folder, the way a man does when he is praying without praying. And he let 2 hard tears fall onto the manila tab without wiping them. Hattie, watching from behind the soup line with a ladle stalled in her arthritic hand, let her own eyes fill up, and she lowered the ladle slowly into the pot, and she crossed herself once. Imogen waited. She had learned, in 13 years, that a will reading is not a transaction, but a turning, and that turnings take their own time. After a long minute, Reed wiped his face on the cuff of his torn olive-drab field jacket and looked up at her with red eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "I do not have a driver's license. I do not have an identification card. I do not have a coat that is not this one. I do not have shoes that do not leak." He paused. He looked down at the puppy again. "I do not have anything except her." Imogen smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, careful, the smile of a woman who had practiced not showing too much of her hand at a will reading. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "we will take care of all of that on the way." They left Spokane the next morning at 6 a.m. with a Department of Veterans Affairs case manager's emergency identification voucher in Reed's wallet, a brand new pair of insulated brown work boots on his feet, paid for out of Imogen's own purse against future reimbursement from the estate, and a small 14-pound German Shepherd puppy named Juno, asleep on a clean folded Sherpa blanket on the floor of the rental sedan, with her chin on Reed's right boot and her crooked ears twitching in dreams. Hattie hugged Reed at the door of Sacred Heart, with both arthritic arms locked around his ribs and her round wire-rimmed glasses fogged. "You write to me when you get there, Reed Calloway," she said. "You write to me when you sleep under a roof," he promised her. He kissed the top of her thin silver hair. He stepped out into the cold, blue Spokane morning with Juno in the crook of his left arm and his battered olive canvas duffel slung across his back, and Imogen Trask waiting at the curb beside the silver Toyota with a thermos of better coffee in her gloved hand, and Reed Calloway, who had told himself 90 days ago that he would walk into the river, walked, instead, east, toward the Idaho line with a puppy and a lawyer and a manila folder marked Calloway, Reed M. They drove for 9 hours. Imogen kept the heat low because Reed had quietly told her, somewhere east of Coeur d'Alene, that he had not sat in a heated car since 2021, and that the heat made him sleepy in a way that scared him. So she drove with the heat at 66 and the radio off and the snow falling slow and clean past the windshield and the long, flat curve of Highway 90 unrolling under them. And Reed sat in the passenger seat with Juno asleep across his lap and his rough, chapped hand resting on her small black and tan saddle. They did not talk for the first 3 hours. Then, somewhere past the Bitterroot Range, with the white mountains rising on both sides and the late sun coming through the front windshield in long copper bars, Reed said, very quietly, without looking at Imogen, only at the road. "Ma'am, did Eleanor know how the captain died?" Imogen did not look at him either. She kept her eyes on the road. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "Mrs. Volkov knew that her husband died in Anbar Province on the 2nd of February 2012, from injuries sustained when an improvised explosive device detonated under the lead vehicle of his patrol. She knew that her husband bled to death from femoral arterial injuries despite the best efforts of the Marines who were with him. She knew the names of every Marine who was with him. She knew yours first. She knew your name first because it was the name her husband said last." Reed turned his face toward the passenger window so Imogen would not see. Outside, the white snow was falling on the dark bitterroot pines, and Juno was asleep across his lap, and the heat was low in the car, and Reed Calloway pressed his rough chapped knuckles hard against his closed mouth, and he wept, without sound, for the first 40 miles of Montana. They came over the last ridge at 5:20 in the afternoon, with the sun already low and orange behind the white mountains, and Imogen turned the silver rental off the county blacktop onto a long, curving gravel drive that ran down between two low hills, and Reed sat up in the passenger seat with Juno still asleep across his lap, and he saw it for the first time, the bowl of land, the white farmhouse, 2 stories, with the long covered front porch and the dormer windows and the stovepipe rising clean against the cold blue sky. The leaning red barn beside it, weathered the color of dried blood. The gray grain silo behind the barn. The line of bare cottonwoods along the creek. The pond, frozen white at the edges and steel blue at the middle. The stubbled brown hayfield rolling down to it under 3 inches of fresh snow. The hand-lettered wooden sign at the gate. The paint faded but still readable. Boulder Spring Ranch. Established 1971. H. and E. Volkov. Reed Calloway put his rough-chapped hand over his mouth, and he did not say anything for the length of the gravel drive. Imogen did not say anything either. She drove slow, with the snow tires crunching, and she let him have the silence. The farmhouse came up to meet them. The windows were dark. The porch was swept. A wreath of dried winterberry hung on the front door, faded but still red. Imogen stopped the car at the foot of the porch steps and turned the engine off, and the only sound in the bowl of land was the long, thin whistle of a winter wind through the cottonwoods, and Juno waking up across Reed's lap with a small, puzzled chuff. "Mr. Calloway," Imogen said, "welcome to Boulder Spring." Reed could not move. He sat there with the puppy half on his lap and his blue-gray eyes on the white farmhouse, and his throat closed up tight around 11 years of breath he had not been allowed to release. Imogen reached into the inside pocket of her navy overcoat and took out a long cream envelope sealed in red wax and held it out to him. "This is the sealed letter. Mrs. Volkov asked me to give it to you here, on this porch, before you sign anything." Reed took the envelope. He turned it over in his rough-chapped hand. The wax seal had a small impression in it, the impression of a tiny anchor and globe, the marine emblem the captain had worn on his collar. Imogen got out of the car. She closed the door quietly behind her and walked a slow, careful loop around the dooryard with her satchel against her hip and her oxblood Oxfords sinking into the new snow, giving the man and the puppy and the porch the only thing she had left to give them, which was distance. Reed opened the door of the rental. He set Juno on the snow. The puppy sank into her belly and looked up at him with comic indignation and immediately tried to climb back into the car, and Reed laughed once, a low, cracked sound, and lifted her into the crook of his left arm and walked up the 3 porch steps with the cream envelope in his right hand. He sat down on the cold porch swing under the eave. He set the puppy on his thigh. He broke the wax seal. The letter was written in a steady, looping old woman hand on 3 sheets of cream stationery with a small embossed pine cone at the top corner. He read it twice. The first time he could not see the words for the wet in his eyes. The second time he made himself read every line. "Reed, I have been writing this letter to you since the August after Henrik died. I have rewritten it every August since. This is the version I am going to leave you. My husband told me your name on the morning he shipped to Anbar. He said, 'Eleanor, there is a young sergeant in my platoon, a combat engineer from Spokane. His name is Calloway. His mother is dead, and his father is gone, and the Marine Corps is the only thing he has. And I'm going to look out for him because he reminds me of me when I was 22 years old and afraid. I want you to remember his name.' So I remembered it. Then, in February, Reed, after the news came, the chaplain told me what you did. He told me you held my husband's chest closed with both your hands for 19 minutes. He told me you would not let go even when the corpsman reached you. He told me you were the one Henrik spoke to at the end. The chaplain told me Henrik said your name. Reed, I have prayed for you every single night since the 1st of March, 2012. I prayed for you when I learned you left the Corps. I prayed for you when I learned you went home. I prayed for you when the letters I tried to send you came back, marked address unknown. I prayed for you when I heard, through a friend in the VA, that you were on the streets in Spokane. And I prayed harder. Reed, I want you to understand something. This ranch is not a gift. Henrik and I bought it in 1971 with the money his grandfather left him after the Second War, and we built every fence on it together, and we buried 2 horses and 1 bird dog and 1 stillborn child here, and we loved each other on the porch. I am imagining you reading this on, and we agreed, Henrik and I, in the summer of 1998, that if either of us ever lost the other, the survivor would find a way to give this ranch to a young soldier who had been broken by a war, because it had healed Henrik after Vietnam, and we believed that healing was a debt that should keep moving forward through time. Reed, you are that young soldier. You were that soldier the moment my husband said your name on a service road in Anbar province. You were that soldier whether you knew it or not. The keys are under the brown ceramic frog beside the front door. The wood stove draws best with the damper open 2 fingers. The pump in the kitchen needs to be primed in the morning with a quart of well water from the porch jug. The barn door sticks and needs a lift on the latch. The cottonwood by the creek will lean in the next hard wind, and you will need to cut it down before it falls on the spring house. The pond freezes solid by Christmas and breaks open by St. Patrick's Day. The mailbox is a quarter-mile up the drive, and Mr. Henson, the rural carrier, comes Tuesdays and Fridays. There is a Bible on the kitchen table. It was Henrik's. The flyleaf has my prayer for you on it. Read. Take this place as a debt long owed, not as a gift. Live in it. Heal in it. Heal others in it. And when you sit at the kitchen table on the first morning, with the wood stove drawing and the coffee on, and you do not yet believe that this is for you, remember that an 81-year-old woman in Helena prayed for you for 11 years and 7 months without ever meeting you, and that her husband loved you, and that you were the last word he carried, and that the carrying did not end with him. It is your turn to carry. Carry well. Eleanor Volkov, February 28, 2023. Reed Calloway sat on the cold porch swing of a house he had never seen with a 6-week-old German Shepherd puppy named Juno on his thigh and 3 sheets of a dead woman's letter in his rough, chapped hands, and he wept, the way a man weeps when he has been carrying a coffin for 11 years and is finally allowed to set it down. The puppy, on his thigh, stood up on her tiny hind legs and pressed her wet black nose against his wet stubbled jaw and licked once, very gently, just under his eye, and Reed put his arms around the puppy and pressed his forehead against the top of her oversized fluffy head, and he said very quietly, just so the porch and Juno and the dead captain would hear it, "I will carry." He went inside that night. He found the brown ceramic frog beside the front door. He found the keys under it. He primed the kitchen pump with a quart of well water from the porch jug. He drew the damper, open 2 fingers, and lit the wood stove with the kindling stacked already in the hearth box. He found the Bible on the kitchen table. He opened the flyleaf. The flyleaf, in the same looping old woman hand, said only, "Lord, hold him until he can hold himself." He closed the Bible. He set Juno down on the rag rug in front of the stove. He sat on the floor beside her. He did not sleep that night. He sat upright with his back against the stone hearth, and the puppy curled in the crook of his left arm, and he watched the firelight on the bare wood walls of a kitchen. Eleanor and Henrik Volkov had cooked breakfast in for 41 years, and at 6 in the morning, when the cold, blue Montana dawn came in through the kitchen window, Reed Calloway was still awake, and his eyes were dry, and Juno was still asleep on his arm, and the fire was still going. Pastor Lev Akins drove out from Helena 3 days later in a faded green 1997 Ford F1 5.0 with a black Labrador on the passenger seat and a covered cast-iron pot of elk stew on the floorboard. He knocked on the porch door once and let himself in without waiting, because Eleanor had told him to, in a separate letter 2 months before she died. He found Reed at the kitchen table with the wood stove burning and Juno asleep on his lap and a small notebook open in front of him. The notebook was full of names. Marine names. 11 of them. Pastor Lev set the cast-iron pot on the stove. He sat down across from Reed. He looked at the notebook upside down. He read the names without speaking. Then he looked up. "Reed Calloway," he said. "My name is Lev Akins. I am the pastor at St. Mark's in Helena. Eleanor was my friend for 26 years. I came to bring you supper and to ask you a question, and you do not have to answer the question today." Reed nodded once. Pastor Lev folded his thick weather-lined hands on the table. "The question is this. Eleanor told me that when she gave you this place, You would either run from it within a week, or you would do something with it. I am here to ask, Reed Calloway, which one are you?" Reed looked down at the notebook. The 11 Marine names, some living, some dead, all of them, in his estimation, broken in the same way Henrik Volkov had told Eleanor he wanted to mend. Reed lifted his eyes. "Pastor Akins," he said, "I think I am going to do something. I do not know what yet, but I am going to do something." Pastor Lev nodded slowly. He reached across the table and laid his thick, weather-lined hand over Reed's rough, chapped hand for one steady second. "Then we will pray," he said. And Reed Calloway, who had not prayed out loud in front of another man since the morning of the 2nd of February, 2012, bowed his head over a kitchen table in a house he had not earned, and prayed. 5 years passed at Boulder Spring Ranch. 5 winters, 5 springs, 5 summers, 5 autumns of cottonwood gold and pond ice forming, and the long, thin whistle of the wind through the line of bare trees by the creek. Reed Calloway turned 43 years old on the porch he had read the letter on, with Juno full-grown beside him, 82 pounds of working-line German shepherd with her ears upright and her saddle marking deep, and her crooked puppy tail now long and full, and her eyes still that same wet brown. The notebook of Marine names had filled and been replaced with a second notebook, and the second notebook had filled and been replaced with a third, and the third had filled. And Reed had stopped writing names because they were too many. The barn had been fixed. The leaning cottonwood had been cut down before it fell on the spring house, just as Eleanor had warned. The pump still needed priming in the morning. The wood stove still drew best with the damper open 2 fingers. The wreath of dried winterberry on the front door was now 5 years old and faded almost to white, and Reed had refused to take it down. They had named the place Snowbank Refuge, because Reed had insisted. Pastor Lev had argued against the name on the grounds that it was bleak. Reed had not budged. He had said, "Pastor, every man who comes through this gate is going to remember a snowbank he almost died in. The name will tell them they came to the right place." Pastor Lev had not argued with him after that. By the 5th winter, Snowbank Refuge had a rebuilt bunkhouse in the old hayloft of the red barn that slept 8, a converted spring house that served as a quiet room for any man who needed an hour alone, a kennel of 7 working-line German shepherds descended from Juno's first litter, and her second, a wood shop in the old machine shed where men with bad hands and worse memories learned to plane oak boards into kitchen tables, and a long pine board nailed inside the front door of the farmhouse with 28 names burned into it. The 28 men who had come through the gate in 5 years and who had walked back out of it lighter, or steadier, or sober, or simply alive. Henrik Volkov's name was burned at the very top of the board. Eleanor's was burned beside it. Reed had carved both names himself in the 2nd winter. He had done it with a soldering iron at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, with Juno asleep on his boot. And he had not stopped to wipe his eyes once. By the 7th winter, Imogen Trask had become what the men of Snowbank Refuge called Aunt Mo, which is what a woman becomes when she has driven up from Helena once a month for 7 years to balance the ledgers of a veterans' refuge run by a Marine combat engineer who was very good at fixing pumps and very bad at reading tax forms. She would arrive on the first Saturday of each month in the silver Toyota that was no longer a rental, with her satchel against her hip, and her oxblood Oxfords and her thin gold-rim eyeglasses pushed up into her dark auburn hair, and she would sit at the kitchen table with Reed and a calculator and a stack of receipts and the kettle hissing on the wood stove, and she would explain to him, very patiently, what depreciation was, for the 7th year in a row. Reed had stopped pretending he understood. He had simply learned to write everything down on a notepad and hand it to her and say, "Aunt Mo, you fix it." She always did. By the 8th winter, Hattie Merriweather had come up from Spokane on a Greyhound bus with 1 cardboard suitcase, and she had moved into the small downstairs bedroom that had once been Eleanor's sewing room. and she had taken over the kitchen of Snowbank Refuge as if she had been waiting for it her whole life, which Reed suspected she had. She cooked for 23 men on a wood stove, and never once raised her voice. The men called her Grandma Hattie inside of a week. She kept 3 Sage Quintero veterinary appointment cards on the front of the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pine tree, and she fed Juno scraps every night from her own plate, and called the dog her partner in crime. By the 9th winter, Pastor Lev was 86 years old, and he was no longer driving the green 1997 F-150 because his eyes had gone. But Reed picked him up every Sunday at 6 p.m., and brought him out to the farmhouse for supper and the small evening service that they held in the converted spring house for any man who wanted to come. And most of them came. And Pastor Lev would read from the kitchen Bible Eleanor had left, the one with her prayer on the flyleaf, and he would close every service with the same line. In his soft, pale blue-eyed voice, his thick weather-lined hands folded on his knees, "Lord, hold him until he can hold himself." The men would say, "Amen." The dogs would lay still on the wood floor. The wood stove would draw with the damper open 2 fingers. By the 11th winter, Juno was 11 years old. She had silvered around her muzzle. The black saddle marking on her back had begun to lighten around the edges. Her old crooked puppy ears, which had grown long since corrected and stood now upright and alert, had begun to tip forward at the points the way old shepherd ears tip when the cartilage tires. Her eyes were still that same wet brown. She still followed Reed at his left heel. She walked slower. She slept longer. She had not bred in 3 years, by Reed's choice because Sage Quintero had told him it was time. There were 19 of her line working as service dogs across 4 states, with disabled veterans, in living rooms and bunkhouses and on hospital beds and on long, quiet walks. Each of those 19 dogs had a small brass tag on its collar that Reed had soldered himself in the woodshop at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, and each tag on its reverse was inscribed with the same 4 words in his careful soldering iron handwriting: "Out of the Snowbank." Reed Calloway was 49 years old that winter. He had stopped looking 49. The crow's feet at his blue-gray eyes had deepened. The 4-day stubble on his square jaw had gone to a silver fleck. His short, medium-brown hair was now mostly silver across the top. He had filled out from 160 pounds to 185. His rough, chapped hands were no longer chapped. He had married no one. He had not asked anyone. He had told Pastor Lev once, on the porch of the spring house on a long, blue summer evening, with Juno asleep at his boot, and the cottonwoods turning gold along the creek and the swallows dipping low over the pond, that he believed his wife was the ranch, and that the ranch had been waiting for him, and that some men were given marriages and some men were given missions, and that he was a man with a mission, and that this was enough, and that he was grateful. Pastor Lev had said amen. Juno died on the 2nd of February. She died on the anniversary of Captain Henrik Volkov's death, 15 years to the day, at 13 years and 11 months old, in the kitchen of the white farmhouse, on the rag rug in front of the wood stove, with her chin on Reed Calloway's right boot and her tail wrapped around his left ankle, and her eyes closing slowly in the orange firelight. Reed sat on the floor beside her with his right hand on her ribs and his left hand on her crown, and he felt her breath go quiet under his palm, and he did not move for an hour. Pastor Lev came at midnight. Hattie came at 1 a.m. Imogen came at 3 a.m. They sat with him on the kitchen floor. None of them spoke. They buried Juno the next morning under the cottonwood by the creek, the new cottonwood Reed had planted in the spring of his 2nd winter, to replace the one he had cut down for Eleanor. Reed dug the hole himself with a long-handled shovel in frozen ground, and it took him 4 hours and no one offered to help, because they understood that the digging was part of it. He laid her in a clean, dry sheet. He folded the sheet over her. He filled the hole. He set a flat field stone at the head and he carved her name into it himself with a chisel 2 days later in his careful soldering iron handwriting. Juno, out of the Snowbank. He kept one of her crooked puppy ear-tip photographs from the early days, the one Hattie had taken at the Sacred Heart Soup Kitchen on the 90th morning, the morning before Imogen Trask drove north on Highway 395. He framed the photograph in plain barnwood. He hung it above the kitchen table beside the long pine board with the names burned into it, and the pine board now had 214 names on it, and the first name was Henrik Volkov, and the second was Eleanor, and the third was Reed himself, because Pastor Lev had insisted in the 8th year that Reed put his own name on the board, because Reed, too, had walked through the gate. And Reed had argued, and Pastor Lev had not budged, and Reed had finally carved his own name with shaking hands, and the board had felt right after that. Wren Trask, Imogen's daughter, came to live at the ranch the spring after Juno died. She was 26 years old, a Helena social worker, and she had been driving up with her mother for 7 years, and she had become to the men of Snowbank Refuge a steady, soft-spoken presence in a long, charcoal cardigan with a small notebook and a very good ear. And Reed had told Pastor Lev once that she had her mother's straight nose and her mother's small mole on her left cheekbone and her mother's same way of wading through a hard silence without filling it. And Pastor Lev had laughed once and said, "Reed Calloway, that is the longest sentence you have ever spoken about a woman." And Reed had not answered. They were married on the porch of the white farmhouse on the second Saturday of June, with Pastor Lev officiating in his soft, pale blue-eyed voice and his thick weather-lined hands folded on his Bible, with Imogen weeping quietly in the front row in her tailored navy overcoat, with Hattie holding 3 of Juno's grandchildren on a pine bench, and with the long pine board inside the farmhouse holding 217 names by then, and Wren's name carved at the bottom in Reed's own careful handwriting from the morning after she had said yes. They had 3 children, a daughter named Eleanor, a daughter named June, a son named Henrik. The boy was called Hank. The girls grew up at Snowbank Refuge, running barefoot in summer through the cottonwoods and the cold creek, and the ranch grew up around them, and the men kept coming through the gate broken, and the men kept walking back out of the gate steady, and the long pine board inside the front door grew longer and longer and longer, until Reed Calloway, at 61 years old, with his silver hair and his deep crow's feet and his old field jacket finally retired to a peg by the back door, had to nail a second pine board beside the first and a third the year after that. Now, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to whoever is listening to this. Maybe you are listening to this in your truck on a long, cold drive. Maybe you are listening to this at 3 in the morning in a hospital chair. Maybe you are listening to this in a kitchen with a wood stove and a dog on your boot. Maybe you are listening to this in an alley behind a bus station with the snow plowing the next street over. I want you to hear me. There is no man so far gone that he is past finding. There is no woman so far gone that she is past finding. There is no boy so far gone, no girl so far gone, no soul so far gone that the Lord cannot find them in a snowbank behind a dumpster on the coldest night of the year and put a 6-week-old reason to live inside their coat. Reed Calloway told himself in January of 2024 that he would walk into the river before sunrise. He did not walk into the river because a 6-week-old German shepherd whimpered in a snowbank, because an 81-year-old widow in Helena was praying for him at that exact hour with her old hand on her old husband's photograph, because a Marine captain in 2012 had said his name with his last breath, because a soup kitchen volunteer named Hattie Merriweather was about to slip an extra biscuit into his bowl that morning, because an estate attorney was about to fly a manila folder up from Helena, because none of these people had stopped carrying him even when he had stopped carrying himself, because the Lord uses old women and Marine captains and soup kitchen biscuits and shivering puppies and silver Toyota lawyers as His hands when our own hands have failed us. If you are listening tonight and you are in a snowbank, I want you to know there is somebody praying for you right now whom you have never met. There is somebody driving a manila folder up a highway toward you right now, and you do not even know it. There is somebody who is going to whimper at the back of an alley you walk past And that small, high sound is going to crack you open, and you are going to bend down in the slush, and you are going to lift that small life out of the snow and zip it inside your coat against the warmth of your heart, and you will not walk into the river that night. You will sit in the snow and curl around something smaller than you, and you will both decide together not to die, and in the morning, the Lord willing, you will name it, and in the morning, the Lord willing, somebody will be praying you will. Reed Calloway is 61 years old. He still primes the kitchen pump every morning with a quart of well water from the porch jug. The damper on the wood stove still draws best at 2 fingers open. The pine boards by the front door now hold 291 names. Juno's grandchildren run loose in the dooryard, and one of them, a young silver-saddled female named Junie, walks at his left heel everywhere he goes, and sleeps with her chin on his right boot, and looks up at him with the same wet brown eyes when he says her name. The wreath of dried winterberry on the front door is now 17 years old, and faded almost to white, and Reed has refused to take it down. Eleanor's letter is framed under glass beside the photograph of a 6-week-old crooked-eared puppy. Henrik Volkov's name is at the top of the first pine board. Reed Calloway's is at the bottom of the third. If you are walking a cold road tonight, the door at Boulder Spring Ranch is open. The wood stove is drawing. The kettle is on. There is a chair at the kitchen table, and there is a dog on the rag rug, and there is a man with silver hair and crow's feet at the door. And the door has been open for 17 years, and there is a name carved on a pine board waiting for the day you decide to walk through. Lord, hold us until we can hold ourselves. Lord, hold the ones in the snowbanks tonight. Lord, send your hands in the shape of widows and marines and lawyers and soup kitchen biscuits and shivering puppies. Lord, let none of us die in the alley. Lord, let all of us be found. Amen and amen.